with the Phillips curve, and they're focused on the unemployment rate, which is not a good measure of what's going on in the labor force. So we're flying into a really bad recession. But you've got this pivot narrative. You can't quite get rid of it. Some of the buy the dips people are still around, so count on them to buy into what could be a horrendous bear market. You got your buy and hold crowd. Remember in 2000, 2001, the Nasdaq dropped 80%. And a lot of people got out, but they said, well, just hold on to it. Well, it did come back, but it took until 2015. I mean, that's a long time. A lot of people died in the meantime. You're waiting 14 years to get back to where you were. So those people are still around, but there is what I call the pivot crowd. So the Fed pivot is a narrative, and it kind of goes like this. Yeah, the Fed's tightening. We see that. Inflation is going to come down really fast. The economy is going to slow down really fast. Both of those things are happening. Inflation, a little less so, but the economic slowdown is there. And the Fed's going to get the wake-up call and have to cut rates. And cutting rates, that's the pivot. They're going to pivot from rate hikes to rate cuts. And that's good for tech stocks, so buy stocks. Now, that's the narrative. There are two huge fallacies in that narrative. The first one is, who says the Fed's going to get the message? And if you look at what Jay Powell said and what he repeated, we're going to raise rates. We're going to crush inflation. I've been following this for 50 years. I've never seen a Fed chairman use the word pain 3 times in one paragraph, but he did, and he meant it. He knows there's going to be a recession. They're causing it in part. Unemployment's going to go up. He said that. He tied unemployment to killing, basically demand destruction and getting inflation under control. He said, that's how we're going to do it. And you're already starting to see some early signs of that. So with that as their focus, who says the Fed's going to, get a wake-up call? Almost certainly not. I mean, they told us what they're going to do. They're going to raise rates. And then he said, if we see progress on inflation, we'll pause. But pause doesn't mean cut. It means just wait a long time, because at that point, core PCE, that's personal consumption expenditure, core, which excludes oil and food, and that's just how they do it. That's their favorite metric. You can debate whether it's the best one, but the debate doesn't matter because that is the one they use. Let's say that comes down to around 3.5. Okay, it's still not 2. Now, what Powell, which is their target, so what Powell said is, we don't have to keep raising rates to force it to 2. We just have to raise them enough that it'll get to 2 on its own. That's what they call restrictive policy. So, but that's not a rate cut. He said that might last for a year, all the way into 2024. That's when he was talking about rate cuts. Now, again, this can change, but they've told us what they're going to do. I always say, forecasting the Fed's the easiest thing I do, because they actually tell you what you're going to do, what they're going to do. You just have to listen and believe them. Now, the hard part is understanding how badly they're going to destroy the economy and when they're going to get the wake-up call. That's the hard part of the analysis. But telling you what they're going to do is the easy part, because they kind of tell you. So the stock market notion that somehow they'll be cutting rates is just false. But the second fallacy is even bigger. Is tell me why it's a buy signal for stocks if the Fed is throwing the economy into such a bad recession that unemployment is going to go up significantly and growth is going to come down, inflation is going to come down. Why is that a buy signal for stocks? Bear market rallies are really interesting. Some of the biggest rallies in history have been in the middle of bear markets, where you ended up losing everything, but for a couple of days or weeks even, it's the bottom's in, and you buy stocks, et cetera. So you have to watch out for that. So my expectation is the recession's coming. It's going to be really bad. Inflation is going to come down fast, but not quite fast enough for the Fed. They're going to keep raising rates, destroying demand, raising unemployment, and we're going to wake up with a severe recession, high unemployment, and a much lower stock market. I was around for the 2008 financial crisis. I was around for 1998 financial crisis. I negotiated that bailout for LTCM. 98 was interesting because it was an acute financial crisis that came very close, within hours, actually. And I was in the room with the Treasury and Italian finance ministry and 19 banks and a thundering herd of lawyers trying to save the world. But we came within hours of shutting every market in the world. There was a $4 billion all cash. You couldn't use the word due diligence because there wasn't time. It was just, hey, the Fed wants us to do this, so let's just do it. So that worked. But it was it was a very close call. They would have shut down Tokyo and then around the world, London and finally New York. And they would have opened days later. But that's how, with trillions of dollars of losses, it would have been worse than what actually happened in 2008. It didn't happen, but there was no economic recession at the time. That confuses a lot of people because, and particularly if you're using 2008 as a frame of reference. There are financial panics and financial crises and liquidity crises, and there are recessions, some of which are severe. But they're two different things. 98 was an acute financial crisis with no recession. 2000 was a mild recession, but there was no severe financial crisis. Now, NASDAQ collapsed, but there wasn't a lot of leverage in NASDAQ. There was no contagion there, but it didn't spread because no banks failed, no major brokerages failed, et cetera. So in 1990, a mild recession, but no financial panic. October 19, 1987, interesting, stock market fell 22% in one day. Not a week or a month, but one day, down 22%. And that was a financial crisis, but there was no recession. So they're separate things. However, they can happen together. And 2008 was an example. There we had both. But I would encourage analysts to separate those two things. Again, they came together. It was horrific, but they can happen separately. My point is, we may have a very bad recession, possibly worse than 2008. But 2008 is a model, and that may be what we're heading for, bearing in mind that these are two separate vectors. I'm going to spend $50 billion to create 51% of the mining capacity in the world, and I'm going to steal all the Bitcoin in the world and take down the Western financial system. First of all, there's no such thing as cryptocurrency. There are 1,000 cryptocurrencies. In other words, you cannot speak generically about cryptocurrencies. Jim Rickards hates cryptocurrencies. That's not true. I really, really dislike Bitcoin, and I'll tell you why. But there are cryptocurrencies out there that I think are very interesting and worth your consideration. I'm for it. I'm against it. Cryptocurrency means nothing. You have to talk about the specific currency. And I'm showing Bitcoin, Litecoin, Monero, and Ether. By the way, isn't it fascinating how the graphical representation of cryptocurrencies is always a gold or silver coin? Bitcoin's gold and Litecoin's silver, Monero's both, and Ether is gold. I mean, what are they trying to say? I think that psychologically what they're saying is, well, this is nothing, but if we pretend it's a gold coin, then someone will buy it. But I just find this a little bit of an aside. But no, it's the same thing is true with fiat currencies. You can't be like or dislike fiat currencies generically. Some people do because they just hate central banks. I understand that. But it's a big difference between a Venezuelan bolivar and a euro. Big difference between a Zimbabwe dollar and a U.S. dollar. So in other words, don't talk to me about cryptocurrencies. Tell me what specific one you want to talk about, and that's a more interesting conversation. I think it's really important because this field is so muddied. The conversation is so muddied. People not distinguishing between blockchain and currency, not distinguishing between different types of currencies, et cetera. I think we need to step back, take a deep breath, and be rigorous in our analysis and think about what we're actually talking about. There's no such thing as a blockchain. There are hundreds of blockchains. In other words, every currency, every token, every so-called smart contract, if you're using Ether, has a different blockchain. So there are at least hundreds, perhaps thousands of blockchains, new ones being created every day. So again, don't talk to me about blockchain. Tell me which specific blockchain you're talking about, because they're not all the same, and this is critical. The main difference, there are many differences in this blockchain technology, but the main difference is validation. Because remember, the whole idea of cryptocurrencies and blockchain and the original Bitcoin and what Satoshi Nakamoto came up with is that we're going to have a trustless system. We're not going to trust banks. We're not going to trust clearinghouses. We're not going to trust exchanges. We're not going to trust central banks. We're not going to trust anybody. We're going to have a decentralized system that a community can validate, and we don't have to rely on anybody in particular. That was the original idea. So the question is, what's your method of validation? And that's what distinguishes one blockchain from the other. So I've listed 4 of them here, but there are others. Proof of work, that's what blockchain uses. And you know what the work is? You got to factor these, 87-digit prime numbers into prime factors. It's a lot of computer crunching, completely clunky, completely inefficient, non-sustainable. I'll talk about that in a second, but that's Bitcoin. There's something else called proof of stake, meaning you actually, this is what Ether is based on, you demonstrate that you have a certain percentage of the processing power, so you step up based on your stake. There's proof of space. Space is storage space on a hard drive, so I get to vote on the blockchain. I get to vote on validating the blockchain because I've decided to devote a certain amount of my hard drive to that process. There's a new coin called Space Mint. And then there's the Byzantine Agreement, or Byzantine Agreement. There's a version of that called the Federated Byzantine Agreement, which I personally think is the best, much more robust to some of the problems we're talking about, and there are others. But the point is, don't talk about blockchain. Say, okay, what's your governance model? What's your validation model, et cetera? And then ask yourself, is that sustainable? Is that robust? Will that resist an attack? Are your cryptocurrencies going to be stolen? These are the questions you have to ask yourself, and there are no generic answers. So I cannot emphasize enough. Coin by coin. I hate to use the word coin, whatever, token by token, blockchain by blockchain. Be rigorous and ask yourself what's sustainable. Now, Bitcoin, Ripple, and Ether, and some of these other cryptocurrencies, not all of them, but the best known are going to fail. When I say fail, they're going to, Bitcoin might have a $200 value as a token for criminals. I think criminals and terrorists might find a use case at about $200 per Bitcoin, but they're basically not going to be anywhere near where they are today. Why do I say that? I don't want to make a claim without backing it up. The first point is they're non-scalable. Transaction times are slow, and then when you say that to Bitcoin people, they go, aha, the Lightning Network is right around the corner. Lightning's going to, we'll see. They said that about segregated witness. They said that about some of these other solutions. They don't seem to get community support. They keep forking the Bitcoin, meaning one day you wake up and there's two blockchains instead of one, or whatever happened to that whole idea that we weren't going to have inflation, and we weren't going to pull new cryptos out of thin air. But these solutions, you have to understand what the solution is. So what they're saying is, nobody has a solution for the inherent slowness, clunkiness, non-scalability of the original Bitcoin blockchain. There's no solution for that. So when you hear about solutions, what are they? Well, what they're saying is take a bunch of transactions offline. So everybody in the room could form a group, or let's say every coffee shop in Brooklyn, New York, every coffee shop in Vancouver could form a group. And all the people who want to buy coffee would join that group. And we would agree, so we're in our own little bubble over here, and we would agree that all of our Bitcoin transactions among each other don't go on the blockchain. They just get settled in this sort of separate cloud over here, and then we net them out. So, I pay you 5 Bitcoin, and you pay the person next to you 4, and he pays the lady in the back of the room 10, and she pays me 7, and we net it out, and then periodically, and it could be daily, weekly, monthly, or whatever, we net all this stuff out, and then we take that net and we put that on the blockchain, so that the amount of transactions that have to go on the blockchain is greatly reduced. That's true. But what are we doing? We've created our own network. I got to trust the coffee shops. How do I know they're not going to steal my money? In other words, it's only a solution because you're completely negating the original idea. Well, sure, if you want to tear up the original idea and start over, that's fine. But don't tell me you're adhering to the idea of a decentralized, trustless network, because you're not. All you've done is create another network. Somebody. I get trolled on Twitter all the time. People tell me I'm an idiot and I don't know technology and all that stuff. And then my more sour moods, I tell them I was coding before they were born. But as far as some of these things are concerned, somebody said, well, you don't understand payment channels. And I actually do. And I said, yeah, I understand payment channels. We had those in the 50s. They were called party lines, which is, you pick up the phone and someone's talking, you got to ask them to get off the phone so you could go. In other words, there was an AT&T network, at least in the United States, but other people could jump in on this little side thing. That's all it is. These are party lines. So that doesn't work. Non-sustainable. The energy usage to solve the problem and make the proof of work in Bitcoin is now greater than the annual energy output of Ireland. Imagine taking all the electricity used in Ireland in a year, and that's how much we have to use to crunch numbers. By the way, every applied mathematician will tell you that prime factoring is a trivial problem.
It's like an uninteresting problem. But it takes a lot of computing power to do it because the numbers are so big and the possibilities are so great. So we're just wasting the entire electrical usage of Ireland. In a few years, it's going to be the entire electrical usage of Japan. Who in this room thinks that governments are going to allow Bitcoin miners to use as much electricity in a year as the entire country of Japan, the third largest economy in the world? That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. It's not very green. It's completely wasteful. In other words, it can't happen. So that's why I say it's not sustainable. It's going to hit a wall. Non-regulated, I don't have to remind you of all the frauds, new ones popping up every day. It's not just exchanges. Exchanges are, how do exchanges work? I want to go to a Bitcoin exchange. Well, you got to go in, you got to open an account, just like Merrill Lynch or Charles Schwab, right? So, or Toronto Dominion. So you go, you give me your name, your address, your social security number, your bank wire information, give them all that information, and then send them dollars, and they say, okay, you got some Bitcoin, here's your confirmation. Really? How do I know you didn't just take my dollars and send me a phony baloney confirmation? How do I know you're not, a Ponzi? You're using new money to pay off the old money. How do I know you're not Bernie Madoff with a computer engineering degree? How do I know you're not a bucket shop? How do I know any of those things? The answer is you don't. So good luck with that. Not to mention Bitcoin whales. They estimate there are 1,000 people who control 40% of the Bitcoin. Now you got millennials buying, 1/100th of a Bitcoin for, $10 or whatever the math is, $100. But you got these, I call them the whales, these 1,000 people who have 40% of all the Bitcoin. You don't think they have a big vested interest in keeping the price up? And you don't think they wash trade, do wash sales? So A sells to B for 10,000, B sells back for 11,000, A sells back for 12,000, B sells back for 13,000. This is called painting the tape. It's the oldest trick in the book. And there's no profit and loss because we're selling the same Bitcoin back and forth. But what we are doing is creating a ticker that gets the millennials, I shouldn't pick up millennials, 3 millennial children, but gets people all over the world, maybe a garage mechanic in South Korea took out a home equity loan or hocked his inventory, put his entire life savings into Bitcoin and has now been wiped out and is desperate and suicidal. That's what's going on. It's basically rich people stealing from the poor. Not a good business model in my view. And then finally, there's no use case other than criminals, terrorists, or tax evaders. Why is Bitcoin better than Visa unless you're a criminal? Now, if you're a criminal, I get it. If you're buying child pornography, you want to use the dark web and use some cryptos and all that. And if you try doing that with Visa, you'll probably get a call from the FBI. So I understand why it's good for criminals. But if you're not a criminal, if you're not a tax evader, if you're not buying child pornography, if you're not an arms dealer, if you're not a terrorist, then why is Bitcoin better than Visa? There's really no use case for it other than crime. And then it's non-elastic. And this is important because there's a finite number of Bitcoins, 21 million Bitcoin. They're getting closer to that level every day. And everyone's like, this is a good thing because, the problem with central banks is they print all this money and we're going to have inflation. By the way, we haven't had any inflation for the last 8 years. Separate issue. I'll come to that if we don't run out of time. But, we hate central banks. They print too much money, blah, blah, blah. So we're going to cap the number of Bitcoin. But money supply has to be elastic. It can't be too elastic. The problem with central bank money is that it's too elastic. The reason, by the way, gold is such a good form of money is that it grows slowly. It grows at about the tempo of world growth. It grows at about the tempo of population growth. Not exactly, but close enough that it's the best form of money anyone's ever discovered. But the problem with Bitcoin, when you hit a hard stop, which they will, and the economy keeps growing, but you want to back it with Bitcoin, so here's your money supply and here's your economy, that's inherently deflationary, right? Because each Bitcoin's got to support more and more growth, meaning your Bitcoin is worth more in theory, but the problem is you never get there. Why? Because if you have a deflationary currency, there's no bond market. The money supply grows based on credit, based on loans, based on various forms of borrowing. The money supply is just a foundation, and the economy grows with credit. Nobody wants to borrow in a form of money that's going to be more expensive when you pay it back. I'm not talking about interest. That's always part of the equation. I'm saying the money itself is worth more when you have to pay back the loan. No one's going to borrow on that loan, therefore no bond market, therefore no viable form of money. So these are all the reasons why this is going to hit the wall.
The Fed's looking at unemployment. And it's based on the so-called Phillips curve. It says, unemployment's down, inflation's up, If unemployment's up, inflation's down. That's the Phillips curve. You can draw it, and the Fed's using that to guide policy. The Phillips curve is garbage, and it's not a personal insult against Professor Phillips. It's the case that there's no empirical support for it. I could give you examples going back to the 1930s of low unemployment, low inflation, which we had in the early 60s. 1930s, we had high unemployment, low inflation, even deflation. Late 1970s, what did we have? High unemployment and high inflation. That was called stagflation. So I can give you examples. If you think of it as a quad chart, unemployment, inflation, fill in the blanks. I could give you all four examples: low, 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 high, high, low, high, high, which means there's no correlation. If you can have any one of them, there's no correlation. So the Phillips curve has no predictive value on its face because the data doesn't back it up. Last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was a flat line. At least where I went to school, curves were not flat, but there it is. Now, it's worse than that because unemployment, even if you thought it was a good indicator of something, particularly inflation, it's a lagging indicator or a lagging indicator of recession, as the case may be. So let's say you're an employer, a business person. I mean, you're an entrepreneur. I start businesses. When you're in a tough spot, when revenues are down and things are slowing down, margins are getting compressed and all that, the last thing you want to do is fire people because it took a while to find them, hire them, train them. You don't want to let them go. You do everything else. Like you turn down the lights, you call your landlord, negotiate a cheaper rent, slow pay your creditors, drive a hard bargain on something. You do everything else to maintain your margins. And then only when all else fails do you start firing people. So first of all, it's a lagging indicator. You're already in the recession before you get around to firing people, number one. Number two, because you held on so long, you tend to do it en masse. It's not like I'm going to fire one person a month for the next year. It's like I'm going to hang on to all of them and then maybe, sadly, fire them all at once because I have no other choice. So A, it's a lagging indicator. B, it can turn on a dime from very low unemployment to very high unemployment within a matter of months. And if that's what the Fed's relying on, which they are, they say so. It's not a guess. They say that's what we're watching. Two things. Number one, you're not going to see the recession coming. It's a lagging indicator, and it can go from kind of good to bad almost overnight. So the Fed's, driving this way, looking out the back window, and they're probably going to wreck the economy. But there are a lot of other signs to say, okay, Jim, unemployment's not a good measure, and it isn't. But how do you know what are the good metrics? They tend to be a little technical. They tend to be things that very few people look at, but they're there. They're not secret. The big one, I think this gets more notice, is an inverted Treasury yield curve. Well, what does that mean? So a normal yield curve, it's like the longer the maturity, the higher the rate. That's common sense. So if I'm going to lend somebody money for a month, I might charge a certain interest rate, but if I'm going to lend you money for 10 years, I want a much higher interest rate because there's a lot more risk, inflation, default, credit risk, who knows what. So a normal yield curve is upward sloping. The longer the maturity, the higher the rate. Okay, right now, yield curves are inverted, which means they're downward sloping, which means the longer the maturity, the lower the rate. Why would you take a lower rate on a 10-year Treasury note than you would on an overnight loan, that's where we are today, by the way. So in other words, this is the big money. This is the institutional money. This is people who know more than central bankers in many cases, betting that interest rates are going to come down a lot. Because if they weren't, that inverted yield curve would make no sense. And so they're betting that the economy is going into a severe recession. Interest rates are going to drop. Now, just to get a little more arcane, there's something called the SOFR futures curve. SOFR is the new LIBOR, there were problems with LIBOR. But these are long-term bets on overnight rates. Treasury is a snapshot of what I think the 10-year rate is going to be, but the SOFR is the opposite. They trade in strips, quarterly settlements that go out 3 or 4 years, 5 years, but the longer ones aren't that liquid. But basically, I can make a bet as to what I think the overnight rate is going to be 1 year from today. That yield curve is also steeply inverted. And again, this is the real, who trades SOFR futures? Well, the institutions and central banks and the big money, in other words. And it's in the data. It's not a guess. You can look at it. It's publicly available. And it says rates are going to drop steeply in the months and year ahead. So again, these are, when you have an inverted SOFR yield curve, an inverted Treasury yield curve, it's basically the big money betting the rates are going to drop like a stone. Well, why would that be? Well, there are only two reasons. One, a severe recession and a steep drop in inflation. And those two things do go together. One more example, again, I don't want to get too in the weeds, but there's something, the Fed has an overnight reverse repo facility. And what does that mean? So the Fed says, hey, give me your cash and I'll give you a treasury bill as collateral, and then we'll unwind it at some point in the future. It's called a reverse repo. So I can call up the Fed, have them send me treasury bills as collateral, give them cash, and they'll pay me interest on that. It's a phone call. I don't have to do anything fancy. Okay, but the Treasury also sells treasury bills at auction, and I can bid on them, and people do. And the yield to maturity on those is lower than the Fed will give you for a phone call. So why would you bid at an auction, take the market risk and get a yield that's lower than the one you can get for a phone call? Well, the answer is that the treasury bill that they send me when I do the treasury facility, I cannot rehypothecate it, meaning I have to hold it, give it back to the Fed when they want it, but I can't give it to you or anybody else. Whereas if I bid at auction, I can take that bill, I can pledge it to UBS, UBS can pledge it to Deutsche Bank can pledge it to Barclays, and they do. So, but the reason I bid more aggressively for that and take a lower yield, I'm fighting for a lower yield instead of the higher yield I can get for free, is because I need the collateral. That's a sign that there's a collateral shortage, that banks are reducing their balance sheets, they're unwinding derivatives, et cetera. So sorry to be a little technical, but the point is when you look at two inverted yield curves and an auction rate that's lower than what you can get for a phone call, they all say the same thing. Rates are going down, the economy is going to crash, and there's collateral scarcity, and banks are tightening up their balance sheets. So they're all bad signs. It reminds me of another indicator, just quickly. Swap rates we have negative swap rates. What does that mean? Well, what is the swap? So I buy a 10-year treasury note and I finance it in the overnight market. So what's happening to me? I'm getting the yield on the 10-year treasury note and I'm paying an overnight yield. So receiving fixed, paying floating. Well, sometime in the 80s, in my experience, at some point somebody said, hey, why don't we get rid of the bond? Like, just pay fixed and receive floating. Who needs the bond? The bond's a piece of collateral, but we can have a contract. So that's a swap, a simple form of swap. So I do a swap with Deutsche Bank, and Deutsche Bank says, okay, Jim, I'll pay you the 10-year rate. You pay me the overnight rate. It's exactly the same as if you had the note and we're financing it in the repo market. It's just receive fixed, pay floating. And that's a swap. But if you think of the credit risk, at least with the 10-year treasury note, I got the United States government behind me. If I'm doing a swap with, UBS, I got bank risk. I got some credit risk in the bank. Credit Suisse just failed. So it's logical. It makes sense that the rate I get from UBS should be slightly higher than the treasury rate. The swap rate from a bank should be slightly higher than the comparable maturity of a government security, because the government security is slightly safer than a big bank. Well, right now, that's not true. UBS, or I'm picking on UBS, Barclays, anybody else in a swap, the rate I get is lower than I get from a 10-year treasury note. So why would I do that? Why would I take the poorer credit and take a lower rate instead of a higher rate? Well, the answer is the swap is off balance sheet, and the treasury note, if I own it, I got to put it on my balance sheet. So when you see negative swap rates, meaning the riskier credit is paying you less than the government credit, what it means is that the balance sheets are constrained. I got to do the off balance sheet trade because we can't use up the balance sheets. That's consistent with what we just talked about with the inverted yield curves, which is there's a major credit contraction. There's a collateral shortage, a dollar shortage, and a credit contraction. That's not a recipe for a recession. I don't know what it is. The key to understanding that is to understand that it's a form of money, but it was never a monetary project. It was always a political project. And once you understand the political dynamics behind it, you can see that it's not going to break up. So getting back to the BRICS, what they need is to expand the membership. And by the way, that's exactly what they did on August 22nd. So I said August 22nd, the Leaders Summit in Johannesburg, South Africa, and President Xi, President Modi, Prime Minister Modi, President Ramaphosa, President Lula, Brazil were all there. Putin would have been there, but there was an arrest warrant for his arrest from the International Criminal Court. So Putin didn't go. He's like, it's a distraction. And I said this would be a landmark or turning point in the development of the BRICS currency. And unfortunately for me, I actually have to read this stuff. And there's a 24-page single-space final communique from the BRICS Johannesburg Summit, and I read the whole thing. It barely mentions the new currency, just in passing in one section, kind of oblique, but barely mentions the new currency. And everyone said, hey, Jim, you said this was going to be a landmark in the development of the new currency. What happened? Well, the answer is it was. They did the thing they needed to do. It wasn't issuing a currency that was going to fail if you only had 5 members. They expanded the membership. They're now the BRICS 11. They added Saudi Arabia, Iran, UAE, Egypt, and a couple other countries. So now they went from 5 to 11, but they've got a waiting list of like 20. Other countries waiting to apply: Algeria, Argentina, Malaysia, et cetera, et cetera. Now, who did they add? Well, when you put Russia, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Iran and Brazil in the same group, who needs OPEC?
Jim Rickards sheds light on a strategic shift in the global economic landscape, emphasizing the growing influence of BRICS nations. With Russia, the second-largest oil producer globally, now part of BRICS, the consortium's combined oil output surpasses that of OPEC. The prospect of an expanded BRICS currency gains significance, offering member countries the ability to conduct trade in their own currency. The example of Russia selling oil to India and receiving payment in the BRICS currency highlights the potential for diversified trade beyond conventional norms. And then Jim Rickards envisions a broader membership, possibly reaching around 20 nations, enhancing the viability of the new currency. This approach echoes statements from figures like Lavrov, who previously hinted at the currency's establishment, although not explicitly gold-backed in a traditional sense. Jim Rickards underscores the geopolitical implications of this economic realignment, as BRICS nations position themselves for increased autonomy and collaboration, challenging established economic norms.
You've got more oil output in those 5 countries than you do in OPEC, because Russia is not a member of OPEC, and it's this second largest oil producer in the world. So OPEC is now inside the BRICS, or the OPEC power to set oil prices is now inside the BRICS. But more importantly, now that you're up to 11, and again, they're on their way to 20, given another year or whatever. So now you launch your BRICS currency, and you're Russia, and you sell oil to India. Instead of getting paid in rupees, you get paid in the BRICS currency. The difference is, instead of having to buy, whatever, rice from India, you can go shopping. You can go to Brazil and buy Embraer aircraft. You can go to China and buy semiconductors. You can go to Iran and buy drones. You can go to Argentina and buy, they have a lot of natural resources, et cetera. So can everybody else. China gets paid in the BRICS currency. They can buy oil from Saudi Arabia, the oil from Russia, et cetera, or Embraer from Brazil. They're very good aircraft. So the point being, when you expand the membership, you make not just the likelihood, but the feasibility of the new currency much, much greater. And so give them one more round. They'll invite in another 6 or 7 members next year. They'll get up to around 20, close to 20, which is about how many members you have in the European Monetary Zone, and then launch the currency to great success. So that's how it's playing out. The gold link, and this is what Lavrov said about 6 months ago, he never said it would be gold backed in the sense that if you had some BRICS, you could march down to the People's Bank of China, the Central Bank of Russia, and say, give me the gold. He never said that. And, again,
Jim Rickards delves into the intricacies of a potential new global currency and its ties to gold, drawing inspiration from John Maynard Keynes's proposals in 1944. However, Jim emphasizes that while some critics may nitpick the distinction between being gold-backed and gold-linked, the crucial point is determining the value of the currency in relation to gold. Using the hypothetical term BRIC for the currency, the argument underscores the uniqueness of this system, where one unit equals a specific weight of gold. The key insight lies in the currency's fixed value in terms of gold, employing the transitive law. This approach essentially places the burden on the US dollar to reflect the fluctuations in the global gold market. The genius, as pointed out, is that the issuing nations, BRICS, can navigate this new monetary landscape without direct involvement in gold transactions. The prospect of a currency's value being pegged to gold adds an intriguing layer to global economic dynamics, with potential long-term consequences for the US dollar.
Again, I don't want to mention names, but, The usual suspects get all spun up over this and they're on all these programs. He never said that. What he said was that it was not gold backed, but gold linked. And what he meant by that, and he was specific. He said, because you have to ask yourself, what's the value of a brick? One brick. I call it a brick. I don't know what they're going to call it. Maybe the Bancorp in honor of John Maynard Keynes. By the way, everything I'm talking about is what Keynes proposed that Bretton Woods in 1944. It was all shut down by the United States, by Harry Dexter White, who was a Stalinist agent. But this is basically the return of is the ghost of John Maynard Keynes, because what the Russians are doing is exactly what Keynes wanted to do. He wanted a world currency, not a U.S. dollar. But what Lavrov said is that, okay, we're going to define the value of one, I'll call it a brick. One brick is going to equal a weight of gold. And he didn't say what the weight is. I say one brick equals 1 ounce. That's just for illustration purposes. It doesn't matter. You can call it a Bancorp, you can say it's a kilo. It doesn't matter. All of a sudden, you have a currency that is the value of which is determined not by reference to another currency, but by reference to gold. Now, you say, well, okay, but what does that mean out in the real world? Well, there's a dollar market in gold. The global market in gold is dollar denominated. You can buy in other currencies, in a store or something like that, but it's pretty much a dollar market. So now we're back to Aristotle, who created syllogisms and logic, father of logic, and the transitive law. So if one brick equals 1 ounce, again, just for illustration, and 1 ounce equals a certain number of dollars, today it's, 1950, up and down, whatever, then with the transitive law, you can say, well, one brick equals $1,900. But here's the key. It's not a fixed exchange rate. As the dollar price of gold fluctuates, the value of a brick as a weight of gold will not fluctuate. It's fixed as a weight of gold. But using the transitive law, the dollar value will fluctuate. But it means the U.S. has to do all the dirty work. In other words, this is the genius of the Russians. They can just free ride on the dollar gold market. They don't have to intervene. They don't have to buy gold. They don't have to sell gold. They don't even have to have gold. You just say, this is what it's worth, and then let the dollar do all the dirty work. With one footnote, which is if you're the issuer of bricks or the holder of bricks and it's worth a weight of gold, what do you want to happen to the price of gold? Well, you want it to go to the moon because you're destroying the dollar through the transitive law and through the dollar-denominated gold market. That's for the long run. Central bank digital currency. And the metaphor I've used is that if you want to slaughter pigs, you have to get all the pigs into a cattle chute and run them into the slaughterhouse and then slaughter them. You can't just let them, run around. You got to herd them up and get them into a cattle chute, or cows for that matter. And so if they want to slaughter savers and investors, they have to get you into a digital slaughterhouse. And that's what digital money is all about. If you can't have cash and you can only have the central bank digital currency, then everyone's got to have a digital account. And once they've got you in the system, of course, they know who you are because it's all digital and they keep the ledger, back to the ledger. What can they do? Well, they can impose negative interest rates. So you have $100,000 at 1% interest, you go away for a year, you come back, you should have $101,000. But with a negative interest rate of 1%, you go away, come back in a year, and you'd have $99,000. Well, cash is an easy way around that. At least you can bury it in your backyard, but at least you'd have the $100,000, in my example, a year later. But with a digital account, they can actually take it out of your account. Number one. Number two, they can put a timestamp or an expiration date on your money and say, okay, here's your money. It's in your account. But if you don't spend 10% of it in the next 30 days, we're going to impose a 2% penalty. We're going to take it away, basically, if you don't spend it. Oh, what does that do? It kind of forces you to spend it. Is that a kind of stimulus? Maybe, I'm not sure. These things don't usually work out as the eggheads plan, but the idea would be if we don't have enough what Keynes called aggregate demand, we'll force people to go buy stuff by telling them if you don't spend it, you lose it. Use it or lose it kind of thing. Okay. Withholding taxes. Now, again, in the United States, I think it's similar in Australia. If you have a job, quote unquote, your regular payday, whatever, they pay you but they deduct the withholding tax at the source, and it's based on the rate. So maybe it's, I don't know, 20%. So you make $1,000, they take out $200, and here's the $800 net to you. And then at the end of the year, they give you a statement, you file your tax return, and you claim the withholding, and you reconcile your taxes. But that's not true for independent contractors, doctors, lawyers, professionals, writers, anyone who you earn a living, you work, right? But you don't have any withholding tax, but you still have the money still goes in your bank account. Well, now they can just impose the tax on your bank account. Say, well, hey, we see your inflows here. You make a nice living. We're going to take 20% of that. Again, send your receipt, tax receipt, and file your tax return and sort it out at the end of the year. That would come as a shock to a lot of doctors and lawyers. So negative interest rates and withholding taxes are two things that are hard to impose if in a world of cash and non-central bank digital currencies, but they're easy in a world of no cash and central bank digital currencies. Well, it gets worse. This is the culmination, just kind of cut to the chase. This is the culmination of the total surveillance state. We already have facial recognition software, very good. It's like your face is like a fingerprint. Everyone's a little different. You say, well, that's okay. I'm going to put a mask on because COVID, and sunglasses, and pull a hat down to my forehead. You'll never see my face. You know what? They have gait recognition software, GAIT, meaning how you walk. Everybody walks differently. Was it that Monty Python thing, the mystery of silly walks? Well, silly or not, everybody walks differently. And so they can actually digitally identify you just by the way you walk. And so your mask isn't going to help you. And with GPS, I have a bunch of what are called Faraday sacks. They're, some of them are nice. I'm glad they're wallets, but they're basically lined with a certain metallic fibers that block radiation. So if you want to turn your cell phone off, put it in a Faraday sack, and by the way, do the same with your Easy Pass and any other things sending out radiation, which are ubiquitous. Maybe they can't follow you around, but most people don't do that, and they do. And so with your iPhone, they know where you are at all times. You may be looking at a map trying to find a good restaurant, but they're tracking you. So they already do that. But now they take it a step further. So you're at the point of purchase, you're buying a book. Let's say it's a book that criticizes Kevin Rudd, for example. He's your leading panda hugger down in Australia, or in the United States, criticizes Joe Biden or something, or, Ultra MAGA hamburger, whatever it is. Well, Ultra MAGA, you're an extremist, you're a radical, you're part of the insurrection. So now we're going to freeze your account or deny the purchase or put you on a watch list, or we just appropriated money to hire 87,000 armed IRS, Internal Revenue Service agents. Maybe we'll assign one to you because you bought the wrong book. So now we're into thought control. We're into basically subduing your political enemies because well, if you give money to a certain political candidate, again, perfectly legal stuff. Buy a book, make a donation, that's legal. But they don't like who you're doing it with. And they meaning the government, they're watching. They know what you're reading and by inference, what you're thinking, who you're giving money to, what causes you support, et cetera, et cetera. And it doesn't take much these days to have some, kind of low IQ spokesperson at the White House label you as an extremist. So this is all government's ever wanted, was total control of the people. It makes Louis the 14th look like a very hands-off kind of guy.
But Jim, the government would never do these things. The tax office would never target a political group. They would never target a group of people because of donations to different causes. They would never target protesters in any way. They would never target someone who's doesn't want to get vaccinated in any way. None of these things would ever happen.
Well, I know you're being actually very serious, but I know that's more rhetorical. The fact is, not only will they happen, they have happened, they are happening. This is the world we live in. That's absolutely the case. And let me give some concrete examples, because I don't put stuff like that out there without backing up. So in 2010, the IRS targeted what we call in the United States the Tea Party movement. This was the first midterm of President Obama's first term in office. Historically, a time when the president's party loses a lot of seats. It's not even Democrats versus Republicans. It's just a consistent pattern of first term president, first midterm election, they lose seats. Obama lost almost a record number of seats, something like 63 or 64 seats versus an historical average closer to 30. Because of people were upset about Obamacare, they were upset about the tax increases, the bailouts coming out of the 2008 global financial crisis favored the rich, hurt the poor. There was just a lot of people were having second thoughts about voting for Obama in the first place. So we had this Tea Party movement, and they just kicked butt in the 2010 election. Well, so these were springing up everywhere. This was a genuine grassroots movement. There was no nationwide top-down organization. Communities were like, hey, let's start our own branch of the Tea Party, et cetera. And because they qualified as nonprofit organizations, there's some rules around that, but you have to apply to the IRS, our Internal Revenue Service, for a designation and a number proving that you're a nonprofit organization. Well, the person in charge of those was slow rolling all the applications. They weren't getting approved. They were entitled to it. That the IRS intervened to squash the formation of Tea Party movements from coast to coast for political reasons, plain and simple. Well, that was 12 years ago, and there was no central bank digital currency. Imagine how much more powerful that kind of corruption is today. But the Fed has a hidden asset.
In a surprising revelation, Jim Rickards talks about the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. He unveiled a hidden asset, gold certificates dating back to 1934. These certificates were issued to compensate the Fed when the U.S. Treasury confiscated its gold, a move that is believed to have legal complexities under the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The certificates, valued at the fixed rate of $42.22 per ounce on the Fed's balance sheet, were originally meant to represent the historical cost of the confiscated gold. However, the intriguing twist emerges when considering the potential revaluation of these gold certificates to reflect the current market price of gold, which hovers around $1,850 per ounce. If the certificates were marked to market, it could reveal a hidden asset on the Fed's books worth approximately $350 billion. This unexpected revelation adds an interesting dimension to the ongoing debates about the Fed's solvency and financial stability. The implications of such a revaluation extend beyond the immediate financial adjustments. It could revive discussions about the gold standard, a monetary system where a country's currency is directly tied to a specific quantity of gold. This potential move could be seen as acknowledging the true value of gold and its role in backing the country's currency. Jim Rickards speculates on how the gold price might react to such a revaluation, positing it as a significant event that could attract attention and prompt a surge in interest and investment in gold. Furthermore, the potential move could be perceived as the Fed indirectly reverting to a gold standard, with Jim Rickards estimating that a conservative 40% backing of M1 money supply would necessitate a gold price of around $15,000 per ounce. In essence, the idea of marking the gold certificates to market on the Fed's balance sheet is presented as a complex and potentially transformative event that could have far-reaching consequences, sparking debates about the role of gold in the modern monetary system and the potential impact on the economy.
If you go to the balance sheet, go to the asset side, the first line item, there's something called gold certificate. And what is that? Well, in 1934, the U.S. Treasury confiscated the Fed's gold. They had already taken the gold from the U.S. citizens by that point, but they wanted it all. And so they took the Fed's gold, but under the again, bearing in mind the Fed's privately owned. So under the Fifth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, it is illegal, it's unconstitutional to seize property without paying just compensation. You can do it, but you got to pay the person, and then people get into all kinds of arguments about what it's actually worth. So what just compensation did the Treasury give to the Fed when they took the Fed's gold in 1934? The answer is they gave them a gold certificate. It can be, you can calculate it. In other words, you can say, well, what is the amount of gold by weight, not by dollar value, but by weight, that is needed to back up that certificate given the historic cost? So the answer is about 8,000 tons. Guess how much gold the Treasury has? About 8,000 tons. I mean, one of the reasons I've hypothesized that the Treasury stopped selling gold in 1980 because they lost gold to trading partners between 1950 and 1970. They lost 11,000 tons. They went from 20 to 9, but they sold another 1,000 tons in the 1970s to suppress the price of gold, which failed because it always does. But by 1980, they had were down to 8,000 tons, and they stopped. Why did the U.S. stop selling gold? We've never sold any significant amount of gold since. The answer is, in my view, is that they can't go below that because that's the amount of gold the Treasury needs to back up this gold certificate on the Fed's books. So, okay, just kind of put that into one side. That asset is valued on the Fed's balance sheet at $42.22 an ounce. Price of gold, look today, it was about $1,850 an ounce. Now, so, what's, as I say, sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. If we're going to mark the mortgages to market, in a world where interest rates have gone up and the mortgages have gone down, it's only fair to mark the gold to market. And if you mark that gold to market at $1,850 an ounce versus $42, voila, you would find that the Fed has another approximately $350 billion of hidden assets. So I think that takes care of the solvency problem. So before we beat up the Fed on mark to market on mortgages, that's fine, but have a look at the gold and realize that they have a hidden asset, a shadow asset on their books that's worth in the hundreds of billions of dollars.
What do you think it would do to the gold price if they did revalue mark to market their gold holdings? Do you think that would create a lot of attention for gold and people would pile in, or do you think it would just be an accounting change that no one really notices?
I think it would be a very big deal. But it begs the question, if you're going to revalue it, to what level do you revalue it? So everyone said, well, the market's 1850, that's about where it is today. It goes up and down, but revalue it at 1850. That could be highly deflationary. And the reason is you, in effect, you're putting yourself on a gold standard. You don't have to. That's why they won't do it. They don't want to touch it. But if you did, you would be saying, hey, gold's really worth 1850 and we have this much gold, et cetera. But at that point, analysts would sort of turn and say, well, okay, well, you're back to a kind of gold standard. What's the relationship between gold and money or currency or US dollars and others, the money supply? But what is the relationship between gold and money supply? What you would find is that at 1850, the gold relative to the money supply is about 2%, whereas historic gold standards were run with somewhere between 20 and 40%. Bank of England in the 19th century managed a successful gold standard between the Congress of Vienna and World War I with about 20% gold. In the U.S., through most of the 20th century, at least the first half, ran a gold standard with about 40% backing. It was actually the law. The law until the late 1960s, I think 1968, was that the Fed money supply, base money, could not be more than 2.5 times the value of gold. Originally at $20 an ounce, $20.67 an ounce, later $35 an ounce. But whatever that number was, times the amount of gold, that had to be 40% of the money supply, and the money supply could not be greater than that. And then they got rid of that in 1968 because of the war in Vietnam. But the point being, 20% has worked, 40% definitely works. The Austrians like to bang the table and insist on 100%, but but that's historically not been required. You just need enough gold to be able to give gold to people who want it when they want it. And if you're credible in that dimension, most people are content to hold the money. So as a hypothetical, you can say, well, okay, let's say we want a gold standard, and let's say that we want 40% backing of M1. M2 is a bigger number, or at least it can be. Let's just say, so 40% backing of M1, that's a conservative kind of gold standard, not extreme, but reasonable. What would given the amount of gold the United States has, what would the price of gold have to be in order to maintain that ratio? The answer is about $15,000 an ounce. And people say, well, Jim, you used to say $10,000 an ounce. Well, that's true because it was true at the time. But when you expand the money supply, the number goes up, right? Because the amount of gold is fixed. So it was 10,000 not that many years ago, and today it's 15,000. Well, if you say gold's worth 1,800, people are going to say, well, give me the gold. I'll take all the gold you got at that price. And then they're going to have to shut the gold window again, and that has its own problems. But in other words, it's not clear how it would work. I mean, there are a lot of ways it could work mechanically. It's not clear what the government would actually do. But my point is, if you try to mark gold to market on the Fed's balance sheet, you're opening Pandora's box. Because you would be getting a lot of people, bankers, analysts, Wall Streeters, investors, to sit up and take notice and say, well, hey, what is going on here? You're back in the gold business. Well, you got the price wrong, because you can't back up your money supply at that level. And the truth is you can't. Just to kind of cut to the chase, the banking crisis is not over. The crises don't happen all at once in one day. They emerge, regulators deal with them. The other new investors come in, they go, it's all good, we got this under control, and then there's a quiet period, and then they just pop back up again. It's because they were never fixed in the first place. Let me explain why the banking crisis is not over. And for here, we're going to use a little financial history, which is underrated, but in my view, extremely valuable. Maybe just because I've been around long enough. I'm kind of a magnet for trouble when it comes to this. My first banking crisis was the Herstatt Bank in Germany in 1974. You have to have been around a while to remember that one. That was a foreign exchange. That was a bank where, in those days, if you were in Germany and the US and you were doing foreign exchange trading and you sold, it was Deutschmarks because it was before the euro, if you sold for dollars, or bought them rather, they would deliver the Deutschmarks to you in German time, and then you would pay the dollars in New York time. They failed in between. They got all the Deutschmarks, but they never paid the dollars because they failed in the middle of the day, and that started a crisis. But anyway, it's a long list. But let me point to two in particular. So the first one I had some front row seat, 1997, 1998, the Asia-Russia LTCM financial crisis. Now, what people don't realize, people remember September 1998, LTCM's about to go under $1.3 trillion in derivatives. That's back when a trillion was real money. The Fed had no interest in bailing out a hedge fund. I was their lawyer. We didn't expect a bailout. We're like, why would the Fed bail out us? Why would the Fed do that? Well, the answer was, it wasn't about us. It was about the 19 banks that were going to fail if we fail, because they're dealers. So if they sell us, $1.3 trillion of derivatives, which they did, they buy them from the other side. And they're relying on the fact that they have a two-sided position and they make a spread. That's what they do. If one side of the trade goes away, all of a sudden they're net short, they're naked on the other side, and they got to go out and sell stocks, like $15 billion worth of stocks, to cover the fact that they were long that much on their side of the swap. Well, I can tell you what $15 billion of fire sales stocks will do to the stock market if they would have closed the New York Stock Exchange, and a lot else beside. So technically, they were bailing us out. We got $4 billion in cash. I'll put the fire out. But they were really bailing out Wall Street. We lost the money. Wall Street put in the $4 billion, but then Wall Street owned it. And they got all their money back a year later, but they put out the fire. But here's my point. That didn't start in September 1998. That started in June 1997 in Thailand. Thailand had a run on the bank. Dollars were leaving the country. They had pegged the Thai baht to the dollar, and people panicked. They said, because money had been going in for resorts and casinos and what else. And everybody wanted their money back, taking the dollars out. The Central Bank of Thailand could not maintain the peg. They imposed capital controls, said no more dollars, and we're going to devalue the baht, which meant for a U.S. investor, all your money was worth a lot less. That then pretty quickly spread through Asia, and then it went to Korea. But here's the point. It entered a quiet period. In December, January, February, things calmed down, and everyone said, it's okay. And by the long-term capital was fine. At the time, we were like looking into Asia for investment opportunities. But then it came back in April in a small way, because Sandy Weil was he was merging city and travel. And he told the Solomon guys, I don't want any volatility in earnings because I don't want to mess up this deal. So you guys have to reduce your books. But the process of Solomon getting out of swaps widened the spreads. We're sitting there long term like, hey, spreads are blowing out, buy more. And then, of course, it came to a head in August. Russia defaulted on their internal debt, their external debt, and devalued the ruble. It was like a trifecta. And then that caused a panic, and then it got worse. And then finally the bailout at the end of September. But my point is, that took a year and almost a year and a half. It was a long quiet period in the middle. So just when you see a crisis evolving and then there's a quiet period, don't assume it's over. It just means that things have been patched up, but it's still percolating below the surface. The second one, of course, the 2007, 2008, 2009 global financial crisis. Now, what happened there? Everyone remembers September 15, 2008, midnight on a Sunday, Lehman Brothers files for bankruptcy, okay? That started in the spring of '07. HSBC reported lower than expected earnings because mortgage losses on subprime mortgages were higher than expected. And that's when Bernanke actually is on the record in the March minutes of the FOMC said, this will blow over. Yeah, and then it kind of came to a head in August '07. That's when Jim Cramer and Aaron Burnett on CNBC goes, they know nothing. They know nothing. And Cramer was right. They actually didn't know anything. But the Fed kept the discount rate and they got the Fed funds rate. And then September, you remember all this, September 7, Hank Paulson's Treasury Secretary, he announced the Super Civ, special investment vehicle that was going to buy all the credit card receivables from all the banks with government money and then put them into a fund and work them out and all this stuff, which never happened, by the way. It was a dumb idea, but it never happened. But then in December 2007 into January 2008, what happened? The sovereign wealth funds bailed out the U.S. banking system. Abu Dhabi, and they were capped at 10%, but Abu Dhabi bought 10% of Citi, Temasek in Singapore bought, I think, 10% of Morgan Stanley, Kuwait Investment Fund. One by one, those sovereign wealth funds bailed out the U.S. banking system. So January, all good. February, it's all good. What happens in March? Bear Stearns blows up because it wasn't all good. That was the point. By the way, if you ever see a CEO saying it's all good, get your money out then. It's not that they're lying. It's just that they don't realize how quickly things can change. So then, okay, so March, Bear Stearns blows up. What happens in June? Fannie Mae. What happens in July? Freddie Mac. What happened in August? The Congress passed legislation bailing out Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So once again, this is your second quiet period. It's all good. The Congress saved the day. Even though Bear Stearns, Fannie and Freddie had just blown up, the Congress in theory bailed them out. It was all good. And that lasted about a month. And then September, here comes Lehman. So my point is financial crisis can have one or more quiet periods. In fact, they usually do. Everyone remembers that when the Krakatoa erupted, but they don't know when the shaking began. They forget that these things usually have a year or longer. So if that's the case, and it is the case, those are just the facts, what should we say about the 2023 banking crisis? Well, we had this, again, March 9th, March 10th, March 12th, March 19th, May 1st, this sequence of failures, big ones, including Credit Suisse, we're in the quiet phase. Everyone thinks it's all good. So let's put a finer point on that, and I'll go through this quickly. Downward sloping yield curves. Now, that yield curve is just the x-axis are the maturities, the y-axis is the interest rates. Yield curves are supposed to be upward sloping. The longer the maturity, the more interest you're supposed to get. If I'm lending to you for 1 month, I want a certain rate. If I'm lending to you for 10 years, I want a higher rate because I'm taking more risk, more bad things can happen. Well, the yield curves are actually going down. What does that mean? It means that the big money, the wholesale money, expects a recession, maybe a financial crisis, and they think interest rates are going to drop like a rock. So why would I take less on my 10-year note than on my 1-month treasury bill? Well, the answer is I think that 4% on the 10-year treasury note is going to look pretty sweet when rates hit 2%. So that's what the market is betting. So it goes back to collateral shortage, bill shortage, dollar shortage, shrinking balance sheets, liquidity. There's a whole global liquidity financial crisis coming. At the same time, there's this whole recession coming. But a global recession is highly unusual, and that appears to be what we're heading for. So my forecast, I do update them, but big picture, it goes as follows. So what is Jay Powell doing? First of all, March 1st, 2022, the Fed fund policy rate, interest rates were 0. And we're now at 4.5%. Even in the Volcker days, we never went up 4.5% in 10 months. Not that fast. And so here we are. So what is Powell doing? Well, he's given 5 speeches on the subject. I don't know why Wall Street doesn't listen, but he keeps trying. He said the same thing every time. He said, inflation is job one. We're just going after inflation. Believe us. There is going to be a recession. Unemployment is going to go up. There's going to be pain. I've never heard a Fed chairman use the word pain. He used it 5 times in one paragraph in the Jackson Hole speech. And that's what we're doing. And believe us when we say it. Now, how long will he raise rates? How quickly? And what's he trying to do? Powell is trying to get to something that he calls the terminal rate. But the definition of the terminal rate is It's a rate that's high enough to cause inflation to come down on its own without further hikes. So we'll get to a level, and then inflation is coming down, by the way. And in the last 5 months, it's gone from, in the US, it's gone from about 9% to 8.7, 8.2, 7.4, 7.1. So it is coming down. Having said that, the target is 2%, and 7.1 is still a far cry from 2. So he's not there, but he's making progress. Now, so here's I hate to use the word conundrum, but it kind of is. Wall Street's saying, you're done. You did it. Mission accomplished. Inflation is coming down. You got what you wanted. Give it time. Stop raising rates. You're going to kill the economy. But the Fed is saying, well, we actually don't know. We can't untangle it. Yes, inflation is coming down. That's objective. But is it coming down because we're still raising rates? Or is it coming down because we're at the terminal rate? Those are two different things. And right now, and this is what Powell's been saying, the Fed leans to the view that they're not at the terminal rate, that inflation is coming down because they're raising rates. They have not achieved the terminal rate. So my expectation is the Fed will raise interest rates 50 basis points on February 1st, and then probably 25 basis points in March. March 22nd is the Fed meeting after that. So those 75 plus the 450 we have now, that'll get you to 5.25. And even the more hawkish members think that that's probably the terminal rate. So, so Powell and the Fed have said, yeah, inflation's coming down, but it's because we're raising rates, not because we're at the terminal rate. We're going to get to the terminal rate, probably 2 more hikes, and then we'll pause. And then if we're right, we'll just let inflation come down on its own. And that may take a year. So all this stuff about the Fed pivot and cutting rates and all that stuff, I mean, the Fed's thinking mid-2024 before they do that. Now, Wall Street are saying, no, you're not going to get that far. You may be at the terminal rate already. You're definitely going to cause a recession. It'll be more severe than you think. And rates are going to have to come down sooner than people expect. In other words, you've already achieved the terminal rate. You just don't know it. And you'll probably be the last to know. So with Wall Street, with the cheerleaders, sending that message, but with some serious market indicators, including yield curves, sending that message, why is Powell sticking to the game plan as I described it? And the answer goes back to 1980, believe it or not, and what's called the Volcker mistake. People forget that there was a recession in 1980. It was sharp but quick. It was over very quickly. It had nothing to do with monetary policy. The Carter administration issued some dopey regulation on a ceiling on credit card interest rates. And the industry said, fine, we're just not going to lend anybody any money. The economy fell instantly, kind of like a smaller version of what happened in 2020 with the pandemic panic. And then they said, oh, sorry, just kidding. And then they took the ceiling off, and then things got back to normal. Now, this was a time when farmers around the country were driving front loaders and tractors to Washington, and they were circling the Fed building. And one guy drove his tractor up the steps of the Fed, and Volcker was being burned in effigy. That all happened. So it was a little bit of pressure. And of course, Congress was up in arms and the White House was up in arms. So Volcker, not quite panicked, but he cut interest rates 7 percentage points, not 0.7, 7 full percentage points to deal with the recession, which, number one, was unnecessary because the recession was caused by a policy blunder from the White House, which was quickly corrected. And number two, he had not won the fight against inflation. Well, after he cut rates and we came out of that very quick sort of snap recession, inflation got even worse. And that's when Volcker had to raise rates to 20%. And Volcker, in hindsight, and he said this in his last book, just before he died, he said, we shouldn't have done that. We should have stuck to our inflation mission. So now Powell, remember, Powell's not an economist, he's a lawyer, so he kind of thinks like a lawyer. I can relate to that, looking at both sides. Powell does not want to be that guy. He does not want to be the guy who balks early and cuts rates, the famous Wall Street pivot, before the battle against inflation is won, because the outcome could be exactly what Volcker experienced, which is inflation wasn't done, doesn't go away, comes back stronger, and then you do have to destroy the economy, as we did in 1981-82. That was the worst recession. That was far worse than the little one in 1980. That was the worst since the Great Depression. We've managed to break that record several times since then, but at the time that was horrific. But Volcker and others have said that was a blunder he never should have done. So Powell does not want to give up the rate hikes too early because he does not want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He does not want to be that guy. And that's what's driving him, even as Wall Street screams, you're already there. So the question is, that's the lay of the land. There's the two competing sides. How does this play out? In my view, Powell probably is there. He probably is at something like a terminal rate. He probably doesn't have to raise interest rates anymore. He doesn't believe that himself. His models tell him otherwise because they're relying on the Phillips curve, which is junk science. I mean, the last time I looked at a Phillips curve, it was flat. At least where I went to school, curve was curved. This thing is flat. There is no correlation between unemployment and inflation. There just isn't. But the Fed thinks there is. So I always tell people, don't. If you want to forecast Fed policy and understand the Fed, don't think like a rational person. You have to think like the Fed, because you have to get inside their heads or else you're going to get it wrong. So they're looking at unemployment, which is the lowest. The unemployment rate is the lowest since 1969. Well, if you believe in the Phillips curve, then that's a sure sign of inflation. As I say, even though it's coming down, it's still pretty high. So they think they have to keep fighting this fight. But here's what they're missing. Here's where it all falls down. Yeah, inflation as measured, CPI, PPI, personal consumption expenditure, core, non-core, year over year. There are like 20 different ways to measure it. It is coming down, but there are two sources of inflation. And it's going to sound obvious, but you got to separate them: the supply side and the demand side. They both result in price increases, but they have completely different dynamics. Supply side inflation is what we're seeing. It's what we saw in 1974 with the Arab oil embargo during the Arab-Israeli war, when they cut us off from oil, and you had to line up for gasoline. I lived through that. Bare shelves, and you couldn't get certain things. It wasn't that every supermarket shelf was bare the way it was in East Germany in the 1950s, but something was always missing, and that's still the case today. So, of course, prices went up, and people were trying to pay whatever they had to get what they needed, and energy prices were a big driver of that. So that feeds through as a form of inflation. The other kind of inflation is from the demand side. So the supply side is called cost push. Costs go up, and they push it onto the consumers. The other kind is from the demand side. It's called demand pull. And basically, consumers have a change in mentality. They're worried about inflation. They would say, hey, I was thinking about buying a refrigerator. Gee, I better go buy it today, because if I wait for 6 months, the price is going to go up. Or apply that to anything, a new dress, new suit of clothes, whatever. And so you're pulling demand forward, and it's behavioral. And that will also drive prices up. But they're very different things. Now, cost push can morph into demand pull. That's what happened in the 70s. It started from the supply side, but by the late 70s, 80s, and Volcker, which we've just been talking about, it had tipped over into the demand side. That hasn't happened yet. We've had the supply side inflation, the cost push. It hasn't yet tipped into demand pull. It hasn't really affected consumer behavior that much in terms of people anticipating more inflation. It could, but it hasn't happened yet. Here's why that's an important distinction. Cost push inflation negates itself. The old saying that the cure for high oil prices is high oil prices, because people can't afford it. Maybe if demand is inelastic, if you got to fill up your Ford F-150 truck with gasoline to take the kids to school or go to work. But if you're unemployed, you're not buying any gas because you're not leaving the house. So it tends to negate itself, whereas demand pull feeds on itself. Powell has not made that distinction. And if I'm right, and I think I am right, and the evidence backs that up, this inflation will come down, not because the Fed is raising interest rates, but because higher prices destroy demand all on their own. If I used to pay $75 to fill up my truck with gas, and now I have to pay $150, which is about right, I'll do it because I got to get to work. But that's $75 I'm not going to spend on something else. I'm not going to go out for dinner. I'm not going to go to a show, a concert, or buy a new camera, whatever it might be. So it does tend to depress demand, destroy demand, and hurt the economy. And then it slows down, and then the inflation comes down on its own. That appears to be happening. But Powell hasn't really made the distinction. He's fighting the last war. I hate to use a cliche, but he's fighting the Volcker War. And what he's got looks a little bit more like the Herbert Hoover War. That looks a little bit more like the 1930s than the 1970s. So the bottom line on all this is the Fed is going to raise rates at least twice more for the reasons I mentioned. Powell doesn't want to repeat the Volcker mistake. He thinks the battle's not won. He has to get to the terminal rate. In reality, he's probably already there, if there is such a thing as a terminal rate. It's another one of these things they made up. Inflation is coming down, and so will probably continue, but for really bad reasons.